let's get started on Chapter 2, Configuring Servers. In this chapter, we will look at Server Manager, initial configuration tasks, adding roles and features, configuring services, server core, delegating server administration, network interface card teaming, and PowerShell. In the previous chapter, we did server installation. In this chapter, we will look at server configuration. Two general ways to configure a server: graphical user interface or the command line. The server manager is a graphical user interface, and the control panel is a graphical user interface, and we do a lot of server configuration using server manager and control panel. The server can also be configured from the command line. Server core is a command line only edition of Windows 2012 Server, and we will also look at PowerShell, which is a command line interface. Server Manager. Server Manager can be used to perform initial server configuration tasks. It can be used to add roles and features. It can be used to manage services. Now, we already looked at Server Manager in Chapter 1, where we performed initial configuration tasks such as assigning a host name and DNS suffix and IP address. So let's take a look at Server Manager. As you recall, in Server Manager, we looked at the local server, and we saw that if you click on Tools, followed by Computer Management, it takes us to the Computer Management console. We also saw that if you want to assign a host name, you click on Server, and this allows you to assign a host name. We saw that if you click under the Ethernet icon, and we right-click on the Ethernet card under TCP/IP properties, we saw we could assign IP address, subnet mask, and default gateway. And that was all review. Now, let's look at using Server Manager to add roles and features. If we go to Server Manager and we select Manage, we see that we can add roles and features. So I will click on Add Roles and Features, and the Add Roles and Features wizard tells us that it helps us to install roles, role services, and features. You can determine which roles, role services, or features to install. So we click on Next. We will select role or feature-based installation, configure a single server by adding roles. We click on Next. We select the server onto which we want to install this role, followed by Next. Now the question is, which role do we want to install? Well, in this case, we will select the DHCP server role, but that's not really the point of this demo. The point of this demo is to install any role. You click on Manage, you click on Add Role, and then from this list you select the role that you want to install. And through this class, we will install just about all of these roles. For the moment, I will just select the DHCP server role. I will then click on Next. It then says, for the DHCP server role to run, you also need this software to be added. And that's a real nice feature, because in the past, frequently you would install some sort of a role or a service, and then when you started up it didn't work, and when you Googled the problem, then you realized you had to install some other piece of software to make it work. A real nice thing about the Windows 2012 Server Manager wizard is that when you install a role, it then tells you this software is also required to make this role run correctly. Do you want to add this software? And of course you add features. This is a real nice feature. I click on Add Features and I click on Next. Then it says what I click on. I have selected the DHCP server, then I click on Next. Then it takes me to features, and we will talk about various features throughout this course. In this demo, I will simply select BitLocker drive encryption feature, which allows us to encrypt hard disk drives. And I click on Next, and it says this software is also required to support BitLocker. Do you want to install this software? And I say absolutely. Then I click on Next, and it tells us it's going to install the DHCP server, and it says you should have at least one static IP address, and we do. We already configured that. We click on Next. Then we click on Install, and it proceeds to copy the DHCP role. And it finished doing the install, and now we can see the DHCP role has been installed on Server Manager. Now, we will not configure DHCP right now. We will configure it later. The point here is to install any role. You go into Server Manager, you select Manage, you select Add Roles. Server Manager can be used to add roles and features. It can also be used to manage services. A service is often called a program without an interface because it's running, but you can't see it. To see the services that are running, you go into Server Manager under Local Server, and you scroll down on the scroll bar on the right side, and this shows the services that are running. Now, one service is the DHCP client service, and typically if a computer can't hit the internet, one thing you want to check is to verify that the DHCP client service is running, and it is running on this computer here, so that's good. I'm just verifying that it is running. Now, there's another service, many services, but one service is the print spooler service. And if the print server just isn't working right, sometimes it can solve the problem to reboot the print server, but you don't want to shut down the whole computer. So what you can do is just restart the individual print spooler service. So Server Manager can be used to assign host name and IP address. It can be used to add roles and features. It can be used to manage services, meaning verify that services are running or restart services as necessary, and it can be used to access other tools such as the Computer Management Console. Now let's discuss Server Core. As you know from the previous chapter, Server Core has no graphical user interface. It is command line only, and the reason we like it is because it has a significantly lower overhead. It runs faster. When we installed Windows 2012 Server, we installed it with the graphical user interface. If we want to get rid of the graphical user interface and convert to Server Core, we go into Server Manager. So let's go to Server Manager, and under Manage, we previously went to Manage to add roles and services. We can also go to Manage to remove roles and services. So I will select Remove Roles and Services. I will select the server, followed by Next. And under Roles, actually I don't want to remove any roles. I select Features, and it is the user interface feature which I want to deselect. By clearing that checkbox, it removes the graphical user interface and makes the server a Server Core. I click on Next. When I click on Remove, it then removes the graphical user interface. And then the machine boots, and it restarts, and I log in as administrator. And here's Server Core. Command line only, no graphical user interface. If I want to assign an IP address, I have to use the command line, and I would type netsh interface, and that's how I assign an IP address from the command line. If I want to add a user, I can use the dsadd user command to add a user to directory services. If I want to add a host name to a DNS server, I can use the dnscmd command to add host records to DNS servers. The net share command allows us to share folders, which we will discuss in Chapter 6. The net use command allows us to map drives to those folders which we have shared. And then the sconfig, the server config command, actually has 15 subcommands, such as join a domain or change the computer name or add a local administrator or enable remote desktop. We discussed that diskpart is the command line utility for creating and deleting and formatting partitions and volumes. And then we saw that shutdown-r allows us to reboot this server. So common command line interface commands include netsh, dsadd, dnscmd, netshare, netuse, sconfig, diskpart, and shutdown. Server core has no graphical user interface. It has a lower overhead, and it is managed locally from the command line. And yes, the command line is harder than the graphical user interface, but you get a faster server. Or it can be managed remotely using Server Manager on another server, and we will do that in Chapter 6. Server core can be managed remotely from another computer. Server core can also be managed remotely using Remote Server Administration Tools, RSAT. If we run Remote Server Administration Tools on a Windows 8 workstation, then we can configure that server core server from a Windows 8 workstation, and Remote Server Administration Tools, we will see, is covered in Chapter 5. Delegating server administration. If you hire a new senior network engineer and you want to give that person full power to administer the network, you could add that person to the administrators group, or better yet, the domain administrators group. To add a user to a group, of course, we go into Server Manager, and then we go over to Tools. And under Tools, we select Active Directory Users and Computers. Now, Active Directory Users and Computers is not available on your server because you haven't installed yet. But we will do it in Chapter 13. You go to Active Directory Users and Computers, and this is a list of the users. There's Bob, our new senior network engineer. So we right-click and we select Properties, and if we look at the member of tab, we can see that Bob is only a member of regular domain users. To add him to the administrators group, I click on Add and I click on Advanced. To get a list of all users and groups, I click on Find, and there's the administrators group, and I could add Bob to the administrators group. And if I do, he will have full power over this computer right here, this server right here. However, if I add him to the domain administrators group, then he will have full power over every computer and every user in the entire domain, not just this one server. So I will add him to the domain administrators group, and then he'll have full power over every user and every computer in the entire domain. If you add somebody to the domain administrators group, they get full power over everything. Now, if you want to make somebody administrator but not over the entire enterprise, you can use Active Directory Delegation to delegate administrative privileges over just a specific organizational unit, and of course we will do that in Chapter 15. NIC Teaming, Network Interface Card Teaming. A network interface card is a circuit board that allows us to connect to our Ethernet connection. You might get two network interface cards for the purposes of increased throughput and fault tolerance. This is called NIC Teaming. To configure NIC Teaming, assuming you have purchased and installed a second network interface card and put it in your server, you go to Server Manager. And here you can see NIC Teaming is currently disabled. I click on NIC Teaming, and under Teams, under Tasks, I select New Team. Then I will give the team a name such as Team 1. I will add my first Ethernet card, and I will add my second Ethernet card, and now these two Ethernet cards will act in conjunction using the same single IP address that I've already assigned and give me 2 gigabits of bandwidth to this server. I click on OK, and you can see it has created the new team. And then we can see under local server network interface card teaming is enabled. NIC Teaming is where two Ethernet cards work in tandem to provide increased throughput and fault tolerance. We've already discussed the command prompt. Sometimes it's called the DOS prompt. And if you go to the command prompt, probably the simplest command prompt there is the dir command, and that just gives you a listing of all the files and folders in the root of that particular hard disk. That's the command prompt, and I know you already know what that is. PowerShell is a lot like the command prompt, but it does a lot more. It has a lot more commands and allows us to do scripting. If we look at technet.microsoft.com, we can see that PowerShell is a command line utility that starts a Windows PowerShell session in a command prompt window. So to start PowerShell, I go to the left of the screen, I select the blue icon with a greater than sign in it, and I click on that, and it looks like a regular command prompt to me, but notice it doesn't say command, it says PowerShell, and the screen is blue. Otherwise, it does look like a command prompt. And to get a list, if I want to get a list of all commands, I would type get-help space asterisk and press the enter key, and that would give a list of the many commands which are available in PowerShell. Now, many of these commands you already know. There's the copy command, the delete command, the dir command. All of these old DOS commands work in PowerShell. The erase command, the move command, remove directory, and rename. If I scroll down, this is the command we're using right now. The get help command gives us help on other commands. If I scroll down, I can use the remove computer command to remove a computer to a domain, assuming that somebody added it to the domain in the first place. The new Active Directory user command allows us to create new users in Active Directory. I can use add DHCP server v4 scope to add scopes, or I can remove scope, remove DHCP server scope. I can use the disable net firewall rule to disable firewall rules, and I can use the add-printer command to add printers. So many tasks that you're already familiar with using the graphical user interface can be done using PowerShell. PowerShell is a powerful command line tool. It's similar to the old command prompt, the old DOS prompt, but it has many, many more commands and allows us to do scripting, which means the automation of server administrative tasks. Chapter 2, Summary. In this chapter, we discussed Server Manager. We looked at initial configuration tasks, such as assigning IP address and host name, at adding roles and features, and at configuring services. We looked at Server Core, Delegating Server Administration, NIC Teaming, and PowerShell. And this concludes Chapter 2. Thank you very much, and have a nice day.